professional looking environment shots. Hey everybody, welcome to my very first tutorial. As you can see, it's quite bootleg, but today I'm going to be breaking down my workflow for creating professional looking environment shots in Blender. Now, before we dive in, I do want to point out that this won't be a step-by-step tutorial that will guide you through every single click. The environment shots that I create typically take anywhere from a week to several months to create, so it'd be quite hard to compress all of that down into a single tutorial. Instead, I'll be focusing on specific techniques that help me achieve the results that I do. But before we get started, I quickly want to mention my Patreon and Gumroad pages. If you're looking for exclusive tips and tricks, be sure to check out my Patreon page. And if you're interested in any of the assets that I've made over my various landscape shots, they'll be available on Gumroad and my Patreon. And don't worry, I'll still be creating plenty of videos covering landscape shots here on YouTube. In fact, here is a list of videos that I'll be releasing on YouTube and a list for Patreon. As you can see on the Patreon videos, there'll be more specific techniques, while the YouTube videos will be more of my general workflow. Yeah, and lastly, I do want to mention I'll be using a few softwares such as Gaea, and I'll be using an add-on called Geoscatter, which are paid add-ons and paid software for this tutorial or my workflow, but that's just what I use. So with all that out of the way, let's dive into the tutorial. All right, everybody, we're on the computer now and looking at my stuff. We're gonna start out with talking about reference. Reference is insanely important, and I feel like a lot of people who begin kind of overlook it. So I was trying to emulate this shot from the Mandalorian. Sadly, it was quite blurry, but I could make out some things like the trees being pine and broadleaf, being of course a wetland, like with lakes and rivers. Then I started looking at real life examples of environments such as this. So I went to the Baltics in Finland, where they have a lot of forests with water around them. And I looked at how the nature and what kind of nature is in these places. So I looked at the type of trees that they have. I looked at how the nature forms around certain areas, in the biome. And I, gathered all this information that I then put back in my own scene. What I'm seeing is a mix of pine and broadleaf species. I'm seeing a lot of, the water is of course kind of like, he said surrounded by this foliage, which gives it this look of, dropping off. But so I was really focusing on also getting reeds in and that kind of stuff. What I'm seeing is a lot of height difference in the trees in the forest. So I'm seeing clumps of trees that are somewhat similar height and then lowering, as you can see here, into like a dip. So you have the waviness in the tree height basically, which normally you don't see when you just scatter trees in Blender. So I thought that was pretty good insight, especially here. I thought this was a nice picture showing how the forest goes from smaller trees to taller trees in the middle, and it kind of like creates these hills in the landscape of vegetation. So I was looking to do the same. So I first started out in Gaea with these height maps created using a range primitive, creator primitive, combining them together, blurring them out, eroding them, warping them, and then having a rivers node create rivers for me. I tried to create lakes and rivers, but the lakes that Gaea created I wasn't impressed by, so I just decided to sculpt my own lakes into this terrain. I have an arboreal node which covers where trees are growing on the height map. So you could say basically avoid flowing water, seek flowing water, and you can see how that changes the map, and then an effects map to turn that into like an actual image. Then I have a texture map and a soil map that I exported for the texturing in Blender, and a sap map for just general color of kind of what I want it to look like. And I won't actually use this. I will use actual textures in Blender, but I'll use this to like maybe break up the tile texture in Blender. It's kind of normally what I do. And then for the rocky terrain in the background, I'll run you through it quickly. So as you can see, here it is. Looks quite nice. So it starts out with a Perlin noise, 0 borders, then a rugged that did absolutely nothing. I don't know why it's still in there, but then I added a stratify erosion node, or whatever these yellow ones are. Yeah, erosion. Stratify adds these beautiful slabby looking erosion with cliffs and also just normal slopes. And I added a wizard, which is the best way to erode in my opinion. In Gaea, it just has really fast, natural, good-looking erosion. It's not as intense as erosion, and I also think Gaea is just more subtle as terrain creation software compared to World Creator. I just feel like the Gaea terrains are a lot more realistic. Then we have another 0 borders node to flatten it out, so I can, you know, twist it and rotate it whatever way I like and still have a good image. Add an arboreal node, same reason. Create a map to show where the trees should be. Of course, in this case, I used the seeking flowing water because I didn't want any trees on the top of the mountains. I wanted them in the little gullies, in the flow zone. I used a mesher with a Tries adaptive structure builder. So that's really awesome. It's a feature that Gaea has where the mesher can like make your OBJ with like adaptive subdivision in places where it needs to be like detailed. So in cliffs you'll have a lot of vertices, but in like super smooth areas they'll barely have any vertices, and this way you can get super detailed terrains at a pretty low vertice count. So yeah, I switched from using height maps to just creating OBJs with this Tries adaptive structure, and I love it so much more. There's so much more optimization using, you know, just an OBJ rather than like a subdiv with a height map, which often doesn't give you that much detail for the amount of VRAM it costs you in rendering. Here we have a texture map yet again, basically just creating a pretty, interesting sap map, which again is just used to break up the tile texture. I also export all the data of the like texture maps here, like the soil and the slope, that I can use to then render or texture my own thing in Blender with like rock and grass. Then if we go to Blender, we see a pretty intense scene, and I'll start breaking it down for you a little bit. So we start off, of course, without anything imported, and that's basically how I animated and sculpted the foreground and like the ship. So the ship got animated just based on like what I saw in the video that I was emulating, the Mandalorian clip. And I did that before I added anything, because once Blender gets stuff in its file, the file just becomes really slow, and playing it back just is unbearable. I think right now it takes like 10 to 20 seconds for me to go from one frame to another. So don't animate at the end, animate in the beginning. Block out your scene roughly, get your camera position, and start animating whatever needs to be moving in your scene, because it gets more and more painful the later, you know, it is. Another pro tip: track your lights to anything emissive. So I have some emissive engines from this guy's model, and I decided to put some lights there with no value whatever, but just track there, so I can then export these lights and the camera data to After Effects and add glow in After Effects myself, which I'll show you guys in another tutorial. The scene layout is quite simple. It's just, of course, the foreground plane sculpted with some extra lakes, since I didn't add lakes in Gaea, and then the background plane and a flat plane in between. But basically this plane here to break up the horizon to make sure that it's not just a flat horizon. As you can see, did a pretty simple texturing job as you do with big landscapes. As I said, I exported like a slope image and then used a color ramp to define it a little bit more clearly. Then just use that in a mix shader to get, you know, a very simple landscape texture. Make sure you use, for the cliffs at least, make sure you use triplanar projection, which is done by connecting the object texture coordinate into the mapping and then turning all your textures into box with a little bit of blend. Box basically means the triplanar projection, and the blend is like how much it blends between the vertical and the flat, I think. And make sure the scale is very small, because object textural coordinate for some reason is very, very big. So like your texture will be tiled a million times. So make sure it's like 0.005 as in my case. So your texture is actually just nice again. And there you have it, the triplanar projected cliff. And now the grass. This is quite important. So normally your scene would look like this once you add your grass texture at this scale. By the way, these planes are like 15 kilometers in total. The depth of the total scene is like almost 20 kilometers. So these are huge planes. And look what it does to the grass and the rock alike, basically. Look what happens. So the issue here is the roughness of the texture. It cannot emulate the actual roughness of foliage. So roughness on a texture is micro roughness. It's like a paper sheet is rough. It doesn't reflect light, but it's not really rough. So roughness is really a micro detailing thing. The thing is with textures like this, if you have your specularity on 0.5, which Blender Guru, I remember, said in his talk on the Blender conference that you should not touch the specular slider. You should absolutely touch the specular slider in these cases, because right now Blender is seeing your grass plane, or any texture for that matter, as a completely flat, smooth field, which is of course not realistic because we want to think it's grass. Now grass is extremely rough, because imagine a flat plane now with a bunch of grass on it. Light will be hitting it and getting scattered around, and not much of it's going to get reflected straight back into your eyes. So actually, you could turn the specularity down to like 0.001 to get more realistic results. So as you can see here, we've turned the specularity way down, and the fields now look like grass fields, you know? They don't look weird like ice. So yeah, at this scale, it's absolutely okay to mess with the specularity slider. Even if Blender Guru tells you not to touch it in a conference, you should touch that slider. It's honestly, you can almost turn it off. You can put it to 0 for all I care. It'll look better than keeping it on 0.5. Anyway, so let's get into the atmosphere. I just use volumetrics for this case. You can use a mist pass with a lot of compositing to get an atmosphere, but the best atmosphere is still just volumetrics in your scene. Sadly, it will cost you a lot of noise and flickering in the denoising, but you just have to accept that you'll have to render for longer for just better results. I 100% think volumetrics give you the best results. I'm still trying to figure out how to, optimize them, but it really looks like volumetrics, it's just a struggle you have to deal with, sadly. However, I'm gonna show you something fun. It's turning the volumetrics to 0.5 and anisotropy. Yeah, there we go, that word's difficult. Anisotropy. What that does, it kind of congregates the density of the volume around the lighter parts of your scene. Now, in my case, I have a gobo, which creates these ground shadows. I'll turn off the gobo. The gobo clearly adds a lot of depth. Without it, it's just the sun just hits it and it's bright all around. With the gobo, it turns the whole scene into more of a nice deep landscape with these cloud shadows. And due to anisotropy in the volumetric, you can actually see where the cloud is, the volume is less dense because it's not actually getting hit with light. There's no light scattering through it. So yeah, I can definitely recommend putting your anisotropy to like 0.5 or even higher for more cinematic results, and probably also more realistic results if you have sunlight. So let's see how the world is shaded. It's a sky texture, really simple Nishida sky texture, 0.5 sun intensity, 0.5 general strength, and then rotate it so it's in the front left of our image. Yeah, hitting it from there. Pretty regular. I like the sky texture rather than HDRI because it gives you more sharp and more contrasty results. I can show you an HDRI right here, strength at 3. If it's just at 1, it'd be extremely dark. It looks really realistic, by the way. I really like HDRIs. They're really realistic, but often HDRIs are boring. I just never get like a satisfying look with an HDRI, while the Nishida sky texture often gives you quite satisfying looks. Let's get into the scattering. I'll turn on all the scatter layers. I can absolutely not be in rendered or viewport shading mode like when I'm checking the scatter layers. The viewport is the weakest part when it comes to scattering a lot in Blender. Here we go, the trees. So for this scene, I created my own trees. Of course, I saw in the biome that it was like a mixture of pine and broadleaf. So I created my own pine trees. We got field and forest versions of it, basically meaning ones that have branches all the way to the bottom, and ones that have, branches that stop quite high up because, shadow is covering the bottom. And I have field broadleaf ash trees, so these have leaves all around the tree again. Yeah, basically they're for, being placed in open areas where the shadow doesn't, cover the bottom branches. And then here we have forest versions of these trees that I created. Basically all the branches are just aiming to go up. They're fighting for that sunlight, and you got dead branches on the bottom. Got rocks, got logs, got grass, got bushes, which is those bounding boxes. And yeah, there you go. There's all the high poly assets. There are millions of vertices. From these 7 million vertices of my scene right now, it's probably 6 million are the assets I'm scattering. So the trees, as you can see, there's a lot going on, and I'll turn off quite a lot before. Okay, I'm not going to turn off the display as you need to display. This is the first thing we're going to talk about. You need to display your trees as a placeholder if they're high poly. You need the placeholder bounding box for all I care, but just do not use the high poly item in your viewport. The viewport in Blender cannot handle, actually viewport in most 3D softwares cannot handle high poly items. You can maybe handle 1 or 2, but not thousands, as you can see here. It just wrecks your whole performance. So you use a placeholder, which Geoscatter luckily provides, or you can just turn them into bounding boxes. You can even do it yourself. You can just select all of them here, go to object properties, go down to viewport display, press Alt so they change all at once, then display as bounds. And there you go. Now all your trees are just some wires. If you do that and you scatter something, then you also get basically at the same result. You basically just don't get the viewport exploding on you. I also reduced the density because, well, I'll turn it off. Oh god, yeah. So this is an extremely dense forest, you might think, but you'll see why we have this many trees at this density. It's quite important. Reduce density back to 90% in the viewport, because otherwise your viewport will explode. And let's get started. So first I use an image to tell the trees where the trees can grow. This is from the Gaea arboreal node that you saw, where it basically avoids the flows, in this case avoids the water, and which was the rivers. However, we can see there's some areas like the lakes I sculpted in myself, and some parts of the river that I deepened where, you know, this texture is not covering it. And in that case, we have the abiotic texture with elevation, our abiotic system with elevation that tells the trees you can't go lower than 61%, which then fixes that issue of trees being in the water. So if you look at the first work in progress, you can tell that the trees are very uniform, and it looks super shit with everything else in the image, to be honest. But one part of it is the trees all being somewhat the same height, even though, you know, you can see there is some difference. It's too uniform. It's just, it looks like a block, basically. So here we can first get some random rotation in, and then random scale. And also, of course, I turned on default scale and made them a little smaller. But the issue is, even with this random scale, it's still too uniform because there's so many trees that we're scattering. Even if there is like some difference, because there's so many in one spot, they'll kind of balance each other out again, and you'll get like a very equal looking average. So now it's time to go manual, as I like to say. Use the shrink option in the Geoscatter setting. Now, I use the vertex group. I think you can use noise, but I don't like using that. The noise texture just doesn't apply well for vegetation, because vegetation isn't random. It's actually, vegetation makes sense. Like the way vegetation grows, you can't just put on the noise texture and say, ah, it grows here. No, vegetation avoids certain soils. Vegetation avoids certain angles. Vegetation avoids water or seeks water. You know, you need to think about these things. So you can't just use a noise texture to randomize vegetation and get realistic results, because often it's just not the case. So in this case, I use a vertex group that I painted myself. It's a weight paint to shrink the trees. And now you can see, no, that's the grass. There we go. This is the weight paint. So you can see it's a really organic looking weight paint, and it's really just flowing across the edges of the forests that you can see, but it's also going into the forest and creating like some diversity of height in the forest where just trees are smaller and trees are bigger, and this really creates that hilliness that we saw in the reference, where one, on the edges of the forest, it's often smaller trees because they don't have to fight for, you know, the sun as much, and they don't have to grow into the air as much. So it's more of like a forest edge. But also inside the forest, I just added some of these streaks to just break up that height. I mean, I can do it right here. See, it just turns this center bit smaller and really creates that waviness of vegetation, the highs and the lows. You know, where trees are have a healthy ground, and so some places maybe there's less water and they just grow less well. Or maybe some places seeds have only flown in there after humans cut it down, and now they're, you know, saplings are growing there again, and it's not fully grown trees. You need to think like there's reasons for forests to, you know, to be the shape that they are. So there you go. Then now the shrubs. So shrubbery is basically almost all of the other layers here are done in manual mode. I've been told often by the people at Geoscatter that I should be using vertex groups more, but no. I love manual mode. I think it's the best. I think it's the best feature you guys have. I can click on it and instantly just start scattering away. So here you go. I can have a radius. I can just boom, add bushes. I'm now just adding bushes, and like that, just diverse, like that power is just amazing to have as a 3D environment artist, to just go in and paint wherever I want to have a certain species or a certain like group of, you know, plants. In this case I have bushes because in the reference I saw at the edges of forests there's often like these, yeah, like smaller trees and large bushes growing. You know, they're not necessarily part of the forest, but they're growing on the edges of the forest. Now there's different ways I could have done this. I could have just said like, oh, I want the shrubs to grow in a proximity of the trees, but not, you know, so close that they touch each other. Then they would have grown on like the outsides of the forest. But I thought it'd be more realistic if I just go manually and, you know, feel it out. And I did, and it looks a lot better in my opinion. And it also is a lot less taxing, because if you use a vertex group, or if you use like you know, all those systems, the GeoNode systems, to place them on certain place, I feel like it's a lot more taxing on your system than just going into manual mode and painting a few here, painting a few there, wherever it's in frame and wherever it's relevant, often more in the foreground as you can see and not much in the background. Yeah, it just works better and it's less taxing. So I use manual mode a lot. Now for the bushes, same ordeal, manual mode. Here I traced the trees, the forests more. I traced them more. I blocked out certain areas that just looked a little barren, as you can see here, to really, yeah, fill up the forests and the edges of forests specifically, together with the shrubs. So this is bushes. This is not like saplings that were in the shrubs and stuff. But yeah, just more foliage to fill it out, and also really create that edge nature, as I like to call it. Like from forest to field, you have like this edge nature that like it's kind of in the in-between zone. It's very lush and often very many leaves, but yeah, it's not tree. Now we're gonna get to the grass. So yeah, just a lot of grass in the scene, very taxing scatter layer. I will make a video on Patreon basically telling you how to optimize scattering grass for such large scenes. Pretty in-depth knowledge that I did not see in any tutorial yet for Blender. I had to find it by going into like 3ds Max tutorials and seeing how like studios did it, but found out it could be knowledge that you already have or not. But I really like this setup I got going, and yeah, basically being able to scatter high poly grass all over this scene for kilometers. Then of course dry grass clumps, again manual mode to add some diversity here and there, pop in some, you know, nice dry looking grass to kind of break up the very green fields that we have otherwise. Reeds, got myself the Quixel, Megascans like reeds, and retextured them and then put them in my own scene. Manual scatter, go trace past certain parts of of all the lakes and ponds and the rivers to, you know, have a nice lush edge of the water, so you don't just see the, you know, flat plane slowly dipping into the water. You just see a very diverse and, you know, lush edge of the water. We got prop miscellaneous, which is just rocks and logs. Again, just small detail items. These don't really make a huge change in the scenery, but like these small details are things that people pick up because they're not vegetation. So like, you know, these actually have some specularness, some shininess to them that like reflects back at the camera, and these small details just make your scene look so much more real, because it's just like, oh look, you know, you see like little rocks and boulders and logs. It just, yeah, it just adds something. And now we're really getting into it. It's like you can scatter grass, you can scatter trees, but what sets your scene apart is time and effort of looking at real nature on a macro scale, in a sense, and in, you know, applying that using Geoscatter's super powerful scattering add-on. And lastly, we added those field trees that I showed you, like the species with the trees or the leaves all around. And I just manually plopped in a few in the fields, not that many, just a few. They're big trees, and they really were like the cherry on top, you know, like without them the scene would look fine, but with them the scene just looks a little bit better. Really finished it. So that's basically how I scatter everything and go through it. I hope you learned a lot with the trees, especially, like, you know, getting that diversity in there, and also with manually scattering in your detailing. Basically, you need to think of like a landscape as macro, just trees, grass. Where's the detailing? Like all the little species and subspecies that live in little clumps, basically, like little areas that they live in. As you can see, the little areas, and how you're going to put them in. You could use vertex paint. I just prefer manual mode. Like, it's super easy, super optimized, especially if you turn everything into bounding boxes or, you know, placeholders. You can scatter a lot of things without it ever slowing down. Almost every single system has a reduced density on them, because they are just heavy, you know, heavy amounts. As you can see, this is the bushes. It's just a lot. So reduce density on everything by 90% or even 99%, because there's no need for everything to be visible in your viewport. I mean, they're square boxes anyway, so it's not like you're getting any detail from it. You just need to know where you're placing them, and that's all. So for the background, it's a very simple scatter layer, only trees, because the grass texture with the specular tip that I gave you looks like grass in the far distance. So there's absolutely no reason for anything more to be scattered since it's so far away. And yeah, there's not much else to tell you. I pretty much covered all of it, I think. Yeah, so I hope this helps you when you're creating your environment scenes. Of course, I'm going to do some more in-depth tutorials as well on like how to optimize certain parts of scattering big, you know, a large amount of items and high poly stuff especially. This scene took a long while to render. 5 seconds took like 35 hours. I had to do 600 samples at like 1440p. 600 samples just purely because of the volumetrics. The volumetrics truly tax your system so hard. If there was no volumetrics in this, it'd probably take a few minutes to render, and I could probably render it at like 75 samples. I have 3 light path bounces for most things. It's not necessary to have more, 12 or 3 with no difference visually at this macro environment scale. Transparency, of course, very high because a lot of leaves. Motion blur, got depth of field. Using tiling. Tiling is a very smart one, especially with these like scenes with a lot of stuff in it. You often fill up your RAM and your VRAM quite quick. So tiling actually really helps with your memory usage when you're rendering, and it actually doesn't slow down your rendering all that much. So I normally just have it at like 50-50, where it just cuts the scene right in two, basically, when rendering. Yeah, texture limit 4K, max subdivisions 1. There's absolutely, you should always look at your assets that you're scattering, because sometimes you'll have like an asset that has like a subdivision on it that you don't know. And that will like mess up your rendering, because subdiv takes an insane amount of memory, especially adaptive subdiv. So make sure none of your things have adaptive subdiv on, since you're not close to anything anyway. That's why I also like to use just OBJs for landscapes from Gaea instead of a height map, because subdivision just takes so much memory, and it often looks worse than just exporting an OBJ. But yeah, so basically just make sure you don't have any unnecessary memory eaters going on, like subdiv. or that kind of stuff. And then you can render. Once you've rendered, you can use SID actually. Big tip. You can download SID, an add-on super image denoiser, and create a denoising that splits up your image into all the different render layers. This is extremely good because volumetrics are often the reason why it's very noisy and like bad denoising. So if you split up the render layers, your diffuse, glossy, transmission, etc. will all be nice. It will actually be denoised super sharply, maintaining all the detail. And then the only place where you're losing a lot of detail, and it's also like kind of flickery, can be the volume. And if you render them all out in their own separate layers, you can go into your compositor of choice and then blur out the volume one a little bit. In that way you can kind of hide the flickering. So pro tip right there, you can kind of hide the denoise flickering by just, you know, splitting everything into its own layers. The way to add them back together is just by putting the diffuse on the bottom, then putting glossy with screen on top, transmission with screen on top, and the volumetric with screen on top, like screen blend layer. And that way you can just reconstruct your scene and actually have a lot of control. Yeah, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoy, hope it was useful, and adios.